Greetings and welcome to Mr. Campbell's Global 10 class. We're in Unit 3.2, The World at War, Part A, looking at the interwar period and the rise of totalitarian governments. Now, this is a large set of notes, so I've actually split it into two videos and two paper note sets, but one PowerPoint. So this Part 1 is pretty much going to focus on Stalinism, and it's really going to end really at these questions 1 and 2. What are three changes that Joseph Stalin made in the Soviet Russia? How did they impact the Soviet Union politically, economically, and or socially? What are the characteristics of totalitarian rule? Give one example of a totalitarian ruler and three examples of how they represent totalitarian rule, or how in which ways they made totalitarian rule significant to their nations. There's a great Yale lecture on Stalinism here, as well as a European history lecture here, for those who are interested in this topic more. So, setting our stage, World War I had left Europe, not the country, but a continent again, in a ruinous state. You had economies in shambles, millions dead, both between the war itself, food shortages it created, as well as the outbreak of the so-called Spanish influenza, a very powerful virus that killed millions of people worldwide. You had the Russian Revolution, which had overthrown the autocratic czar and led to millions of deaths through both famine, starvation, civil war, and violent purges by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. This leads to the rise of a new communist government controlled by the communists or Bolsheviks and Vladimir Lenin, who took power in Russia and then through a series of policies eliminated political opposition and consolidated his control over the Russian economy. The devastation of World War I, economic troubles in European and Western nations, as well as the Great Depression and political instability, would all lead to the rise of totalitarian governments in Russia, Italy, Spain, and Germany. So let's look at Soviet Russia first. Lenin dies in 1924, just a scant 2 years after the formal declaration of the creation of the United Soviet Socialist Republic, or the USSR. And by all accounts, he did not want Joseph Stalin to take control. Most political pundits at the time thought that Leon Trotsky, who had been wartime commissar during the Russian Civil War and was just a devoted disciple of Marxism, that he would be a shoo-in to take this role. Stalin, who did desire power, was relegated to the position of what was called general secretary. Now, this position itself held no real power, but as a secretary, you got to schedule meetings and you got to set the agendas for those meetings. And you also got to basically kind of deal with paperwork and control paperwork. And so even though he's general secretary and didn't get like wartime commissar or leader of industry, Joseph Stalin's going to use this position of general secretary for his own nefarious purposes. He uses it to place supporters in government positions in the Politburo, putting their names and their recommendations on the agenda to then be voted by. You know, if you weren't going to be in line with Stalin, your names didn't generally make these lists. His policy, his viewpoint that we don't need to have a worldwide communist revolution right now, that we can have socialism in one country, proved a lot more popular than Trotsky's vision of let's get a worldwide revolution going. He created political alliances and slowly had opponents exiled, killed, and purged until Stalin is basically in charge, total control over the Communist Party by 1928. Trotsky and leaders of his political party within a party are systematically purged, and Trotsky himself is exiled before finally being assassinated in Mexico on Joseph Stalin's orders. And so what Stalin will then create from 1928 until his death in 1953 is a totalitarian state in which the government of the United Soviet Socialist Republic has total control over the people of Russia and its aligned Soviet republics. So, what is totalitarianism? It is kind of a general term like fascism, Nazism. These are forms of totalitarian government. Totalitarian governments even exist today. It could be argued that modern China, right now in 2020, is a totalitarian regime. So, it's a government that takes total centralized state control over every aspect of public and private life. They control business, they control family, religion, arts, education, the military, power. All segments of life are controlled by a centralized government authority. Generally, totalitarian regimes are marked by the absolute authority of a single leader, a single person who's in control and calling all the shots. Frequently, Stalin used propaganda to create the myth that not only was he in total control, he should be in control, that he's the country's father, savior. They got this great communist artwork depicting Joseph Stalin as the captain of the ship of state, steering it through stormy weather as only he, the captain, can. Totalitarian states generally glorify the aims of the state, of the country, of the nation, kind of intense nationalism. They expect total obedience of the government and decree that personal sacrifice, that your death or your starvation or your privation or even the intrusions into your private life are all for the good of the state, and you don't matter. Simply the survival of the state is what matters. Totalitarian regimes are marked by strict censorship. Books, music, art, news, media, all of this is generally utterly controlled by the state. You got this great quote by Stalin: ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns. Why should we let them have ideas? In a totalitarian state, there's no freedoms, no human dignity, and very little individualism. So we're going to see that the Soviet Union under Stalin and even under Lenin, but he just didn't rule for very long, but definitely under Stalin, is a totalitarian state. And totalitarian state kind of becomes the name that we give what had been called absolutist states, right? This is basically the same idea, only instead of divine right, totalitarian states don't have divine right. They just say, yeah, well, we got to respect this leader and give all power to this leader because he's going to guide our country to success. You, in turn, could be a. And so, what this led to is, quite frankly, a lot of innocent people or barely guilty people being arrested because no cop wanted to go to the gulags, go to these brutal concentration labor camps out in Siberia. So they would just arrest people and they would pressure their informants. Just give me names. They don't have to be people that actually did anything bad. Just give me names. And those people would be arrested and sent out. Millions under the system of repression were eventually exiled to gulags. Please star that. That's a great vocab word to know for your writing purposes, as human rights violation, as exploitation of labor, and as forced migration. These gulags are labor camps in Siberia where people basically are worked until they're dead. Again, this is the Soviet Union. This is Stalin saying, well, we don't kill anyone. We're not executing everyone. We're just, they're getting sent to prison camp to work off their term, a 3-year or 5-year sentence. But these conditions in these camps are so brutal. The prisoners are given such little food, such little protective clothing, and the environment's so harsh that so many people died of exposure, malnutrition, etc. And of course, yes, at times the NKVD just straight up shot people, just blowing their brains out the back of their heads. Really, really violent system. And overseeing the NKVD, besides Stalin, was this monster, Levantria Beria. He was Stalin's head of the NKVD, and he was an utter monster of a human being. He was effectively known by everyone in the upper high command of Stalin's regime to be a mass rapist. And Stalin basically just looked the other way because Beria was loyal and kept the secret police, the NKVD, loyal to Stalin and did whatever Stalin wanted. And, an example of just how brutal this guy was and how much other people in the high command knew he was a monster was after Stalin's death, this guy was put on trial almost immediately and executed for his violent crimes towards women and towards people in general. That's not enough. Stalin fears enemies everywhere. And so from 1936 to 1938, Stalin initiates what's known as the Great Purge. Basically, another series of Lenin-esque Red Terror purges, eliminating anyone, not just, perceived enemies of the state, but also members of the Communist Party itself, who Stalin thought were too much of a rival for power, too much of rivals for influence. Stalin uses as his excuse to initiate this massive purge the assassination of one of his erstwhile political allies, a communist politician named Sergei Kirov in 1934. We actually know now that Kirov's assassination was known by Stalin and was most likely ordered by Stalin. So he uses this assassination to unleash this purge, but he himself killed Kirov in this assassination plot because he had too much influence in the party. It's crazy. So the Great Purge targeted all these what are called fifth column or enemies of the state, quote unquote secret enemies of the state. Anyone he thought endangered his control over the Soviet Union. So one group, former Bolsheviks, people who had fought in the revolution, who had helped Lenin claim power, military commanders of the Red Army, they were too much of rivals for power. Bam, exiled to Siberia or shot and dumped in mass graves. The clergy, thousands and thousands of priests are exiled and executed by Stalin in the Great Purge. Former aristocrats, those who hadn't been smart enough to actually get out of Russia, their families and even their servants just for being associated with aristocrats. The intelligista, this is a common theme we see in these totalitarian and especially in communist regimes. Anyone with college degrees, because they have generally a better capability of reasoning, of analysis, and of basically pointing out that doesn't make sense, we should talk about this. They are viewed as threats. So you have massive purges of teachers, artists, musicians, writers, and even doctors. There's a small group of doctors who try to assassinate Stalin. The attempt fails. And so Stalin purges Moscow and large portions of Russia of all qualified doctors, leaving not very many doctors in all of Russia. Another class he targeted, and I'd like you to star this one, are the kulaks. So kulaks is a word that the regents probably will not translate. It's got a bunch of different meanings. Basically, middle-class farmers and townspeople is a good term. These are anyone who weren't poor, basically. The kulaks were anyone who resisted collectivization, resisted grain requisitions, anyone who had made money on Lenin's new economic policy. It just becomes a catch-all term for anyone that's a bad guy according to Stalin is really what kulaks were. But it's a lot of very innocent people who are dumped into this term of kulaks and purged. And also Stalin purged the military. Out of 103 generals and admirals, 81 were purged, either exiled or executed, as well as 30,000 other soldiers, mostly officers and non-commissioned officers. So arguably your most skilled, your best people. Because Stalin didn't trust these generals. He says, well, they either worked for the czarists and then joined us later, so they're suspect, or that they're rivals for power, so they're totally sus. So from 37 to 38, the NKVD executed 680,000 people. 1,000 people a day just straight up shot. Again, millions more exiled. The youngest that we know of was this kid named Misha, who under Stalin's regime, basically they had government issue bread, and his grandfather was sick and couldn't come to claim his own bread. So Misha basically swiped an extra loaf, being like, this is for my grandfather, I need mine. And my grandfather's too sick to get out of bed to present his ID card to get his loaf of bread. For that, he was arrested and executed for stealing government bread. Literally killed the kid for stealing bread to feed his starving family, showing the ruthlessness of this violent Stalinist regime. Another element of this Great Purge was the desire to build fear and to make it seem like there really were enemies everywhere. And it's not Stalin just killing people, but he tried to build this story that there were enemies everywhere in the Soviet Union, and Stalin was saving the Soviet Union. Stalin was saving the common people. And this ties into this idea of show trials or the Moscow trials. These are fake trials. For all intents and purposes, you're dragging political opponents in front of cameras. And yes, many of these were put on film and shown in movie theaters. And at the end of the day, the people on trial are forced to confess, usually by threatening them with brutal physical torture, their families with torture, or saying, listen, here's the deal. You go out tomorrow in this trial, you confess to everything, you admit to everything, and we'll let your family live. You'll get exiled, but your family lives. And so Stalin held a whole bunch of these trials, taped them, showed them in movie theaters, reported on them in his newspaper, Pravda. And again, because of these trials, thousands more, eventually millions more, were sent to those gulags. These are a couple of later drawings / paintings of these gulags by someone who lived through it. So these were painted by someone who was sent out, who was exiled to these labor camps in Siberia, was later freed, and then basically drew and painted what he had seen there. So you can see here, they're not even using cattle cars. They're just marching people through the Siberian wasteland with NKVD guards and war dogs or guard dogs. And if you fell in line, if you got slow and collapsed because of the marching through brutal conditions, they just shot you and left you. And then when you arrive at your destination, there you are at a labor camp, cutting rock out of frozen rock and ice, and eventually you die of malnutrition and exposure to the elements. Stalin created a troika, or secret police, these secret tribunals, again, that are able to interrogate, execute people without trial. The effects of these great purges: 750,000 killed, 1 million sent to the gulags, many of them dying there. The military of the Soviet Union was severely weakened. Generally, Stalin tended to target the best officers because they were the most, quote unquote, dangerous to him. And so what this leads to is when the Soviet Union has to begin fighting World War II against the Nazis, they're not super skilled at it. But an effect of this as well is Stalin's power and authority remain absolute and nearly unquestioned until his death in 1953. So if this policy, this Great Purge, is for Stalin to hold all the control in Russia, it is effective. I guess I would ask, at what cost he was willing to spend. And it turns out millions of people was no problem to him. Under Stalin's repressive regime, religion was replaced with communism. Stalin didn't want you having two moral compasses. He didn't want you to have two masters, only communism. And with strict atheism at its core could be what survived in Soviet Russia. Churches were either torn down, burned, or repurposed, turned into like storage facilities. Church art and icons, gold and silver and priceless relics of the past, were defaced, left to degrade, or looted. And you saw as from the time period of Stalin's control, right, shortly in 1927 until 1940, the number of churches went from 30,000 to less than 500. In the ensuing decades, fewer and fewer churches existed. And they used all sorts of kind of legal mumbo jumbo to try and get rid of these. Sometimes not renewing permits to fix churches, then passing laws that any buildings that aren't fixed to modern codes must be demolished, and therefore getting to control over these because they're not allowed to do repairs, but they're not up to code, so you can demolish the church. The priests themselves were widely arrested and again sent to those labor camps or just straight up executed. In 1937, we have records that 168 Eastern Orthodox priests were arrested and 100,000 of them were shot to death within a year. Women in the Soviet Union actually had their lot in life improve. I know it seems crazy, but yes, it's pretty easily arguable that the life of a Soviet Union woman was better than many women lived under Tsarist Russia. Their social status improved because they were seen as comrades or equals of men, at least, in theory. Education of women improved radically as the Soviets did educate all men and women up to eventually what will be high school age. So that is a huge improvement where women before were very undereducated because that was just the patriarchal society they lived in. Millions and millions of women are allowed to enter the workforce, and they are allowed to do this both because it's expected of the Soviet Union, but also because daycare and public education allowed women to enter the workforce. And the Soviet Union set up daycares, set up childcare, and set up schools for this purpose. However, motherhood is still seen as central to Soviet women's lives and was considered a patriotic duty. In fact, they created medals for women who had a certain number of children, 5 children, 8 children, 10 children, and 12 children. Childcare was provided, again, by the state, allowing these women to enter the workforce. But we must keep in mind and must view things through the perspective that while women are considered, comrades, they're allowed to enter the workforce. Generally, there was, to use a modern terms parlance, a glass ceiling that women still in the Soviet Union are generally denied access to the highest level jobs. They're kept in these middle rank, middle management type of jobs. You're never going to be CEOs of state-run factories. They were never going to be generals in the military. They were never going to be head research scientists. They were always kind of kept in these subservient roles, no matter how much the Soviet Union spoke of equality. There was, only so high could women rise. Now, Stalin has a vision of the Soviet Union under his control, and he is going to do everything in his power, which was total, right? Total control, totalitarianism, in order to enforce his vision of the Soviet Union. And so what Stalin institutes is what is called a command economy, an economy in which the government makes all economic decisions. What is made, who makes it, how much of it we make, and how things are distributed. This is the exact opposite of capitalism. And arguably, this was kind of the goal of Lenin too under wartime communism. It just didn't work well under him and crashed their economy. The goal of Stalin's vision in this command economy is to make the Soviet Union a worldwide industrial power. How? They're going to create 5-year plans, setting out all economic, industrial, and agricultural production for 5 years. The goal of which to increase agricultural production, to feed the cities, feed the army, feed the people, and to increase industrial output, primarily measured in coal, oil production, and steel production or iron production. And so you have these 5-year plans, right, where they plan the entire economy out for a period of 5 years. Stalin wants to focus on heavy industry, steel production, coal production, iron production, etc. And he also wanted to create agricultural collectives. So these are such big ideas. We have to go into each one of these in detail. But, I just like to cast the wide, generalized note and then go into the details. Stalin creates a command economy to make the Soviet Union a worldwide industrial power. What will that do? He's going to create 5-year plans, planning out all industrial and agricultural output, focusing on heavy industry, and creating agricultural collectives in order to achieve his goals. 5-year plans. What are they? Again, plan out the entire economy for 5 years. Setting, here's our fun word that we've seen on and off again this year, quotas on food and industrial production. These quotas are set, known by the powers that be in the government, and then collected. So industrial collectivization, you're going to focus on heavy industry, steel, factory production, etc., and agricultural collectivization by building collective farms or government-owned farms. Arguably, the 5-year plans are successful as the Soviet Union does, albeit slowly, become a worldwide industrial power. But I would like to point out that this worldwide industrial power, generally their goods were of poor quality. They did not produce many consumer goods. There were, what would you like to wear? Blue overalls or blue overalls? Like, there was no choice. There weren't different things you could pick. And the regime did this through violence and oppression and fear and terror. So it's like, all right, great, you improved industrial productivity, but like we're all terrified of secret police putting a bag over our head, dragging us to a basement or a field in some godforsaken part of Russia and blowing our brains out. Doesn't seem like a super great trade-off. So when we say Stalin's going to focus this command economy on heavy industry, what does that mean? Well, it means focusing it on iron, steel, the production of machinery, weapons, coal, electricity, and oil in the Stalinist Russia, and working to industrialize, increasing the number of factories, increasing the number of goods produced in factories, increasing the machines in factories to then increase the goods that these factories can produce. Again, the government is going to set quotas or set amounts, how much we have to produce, who gets what, and how much people and places get. It is arguably successful. Industrial production, as measured in iron, steel, oil, coal, and weapons, does increase by 50% in the 5-year plan. Again, the quality of these goods, relatively low. Consumer goods, things that people like actually wanted, not produced in large numbers. And trade unions, which are supposed to fight for workers' rights, were outlawed. Any attempt to strike was crushed violently by the secret police and the military. You got this great political cartoon, a propaganda poster here. Propaganda for heavy industry. The smoke chimneys is the breath of Russia, showing that, this industrialization is a good thing, that this is the very breath of the Soviet Union. Lots of propaganda used to show the impact of these 5-year plans, and also just try and get people on board. You've got the Stalinist worker here with the heavy industry in the background, the smokestacks, the oil refineries, the oil tankers on a train. This guy's doing his part. You have this great one. You have the Soviet worker looking at red or Soviet or Bolshevik productivity, which is increasing as the sun shines glowingly on Russia. Meanwhile, the capitalist with his evil overcoat and his contracts and his business stuff and his gold rings, their economy is plummeting. Because you have to remember, Stalin is in control of the Soviet Union during the Great Depression. So, he could kind of point to America and England and France and be like, yeah, look at what capitalism does. You had other posters showing the agricultural surpluses of the system, giant loaves of bread, a Soviet village at harvest time. All of these used to boost the morale of the Soviet worker and to inspire them to work harder. Which brings us to our collectives. Now, this is one that kids always struggle with. It is kind of a weird term, collectivization. Sometimes they use the kolkhoz, the Russian for it. This is a major part of Stalin's command economy, and it has appeared on a ton of regencies because it significantly affected millions of people in the Soviet Union. So basically, Stalin wants to go back to like a wartime communism vision of food production. Only he wants to take it even further than Lenin did. He wants to create what were called agricultural collectives or kolkhozes. What this is a government-owned farm where peasants work, Russian peasants, on a quota system. This process begins in the first 5-year plan in 1929. The government, under this collectivization program, should own all land and thereby control and own all agricultural produce, not just the surplus. They literally control all the food. And it is wildly effective. I mean, if that's its goal, it's effective in controlling food production. By 1940, almost 99.8% of all land in Russia was owned by the state and farmed collectively. Now, again, the goal of this to increase agricultural production and to control the people through controlling food. Peasants were forced to forfeit their land to the government, where it would be split into small parcels assigned to different work groups and worked. All the produce then gathered by the Soviet Union government, by the NKVD, by the military, and distributed to who they thought should get the food. A big part of agricultural collectivization fit in with heavy industry, and that's the idea of using modern machines. So the 5-year plans are also about modernization, right? Build up the industry, build up the electrical grid, build up coal, iron, and steel production, use modern means of farm production. And they had tons of tractors. Stalin had this famous, massive Stalinist factory built that just churned out tractors in Stalingrad. It was like the size of a city in and of itself. It was the site of some very famous battles of World War II. Under this collective system, under agricultural collectives, peasants had to sell their grain to the Soviet government at prices set by the government, which very frequently were artificially low. You could call this, I think, very easily an exploitation of labor. Peasants have to work government-owned land. They do not own their own land. They have to sell all of their grain to the Soviet government at prices dictated by the government, which frequently were, well, not really enough money certainly not for the peasants to do well and to find success. And there was a lot of resistance to this collectivization. The peasants, the farmers, they hated this system, utterly hated. So we can see here a chart. Are we looking at this? Is this effective, this 5-year plan system? Well, we have, on the one hand, industry, right? Tons produced of steel and coal. And you see coal production shoots through the roof. Steel production has modest gains. Well, what about agriculture and food production? Not so good. Livestock, cows, chickens, and pigs plummets under the first 5-year plan before finally making slow, steady, and shaky gains in the ensuing years. Same thing, initially you have a brief spike here, and then you have another plummeting of agricultural production of wheat and barley before you have modest gains later on, and then eventually pretty decent production of food, and then you'll see more drop-offs there too. So we would say the 5-year plan is successful for industry, probably less so with agriculture. There's going to be food shortages. So what are the effects of collectivization? Well, how is this significant? One, wildly unpopular. There again, just like we saw under Lenin's wartime communism, there's little to no incentive to work harder or grow more. There's no incentive to improve the land, to dig irrigation, or to bring new land under cultivation. So it's at first going to brutally reduce agricultural output, and it leads to famines, because Stalin still shows up with his people and they take any food they find. Anyone who was trying to hide food was labeled a kulak. And this becomes really Stalin's scapegoat. When the famines are occurring and people are dying, Stalin uses his vast propaganda machine to blame the so-called wealthy peasants. Wealthy in this sense was like anyone with 2 nickels to rub together or even a nickel to flick around. I mean, if you had anything more than starving, you could be labeled a kulak. And so this failed system of collectivization led to famine and food shortages and another 10 million dead from famine. Brutal. Anyone who resisted this, there were whole villages and towns that resisted this, were either killed or sent to those gulags and labor camps, labeled as a kulak, labeled as an enemy of the state, and they're gone. Hoarding of food, sabotage was common. You had some peasants who would burn down grain silos. In the Ukraine, you had peasants who would kill their cattle rather than let them be taken by the government. But that also contributes to food shortages and famine. So in the beginning, collectivization of agriculture decreased agricultural production, especially in the first 5-year plan. One of the greatest examples of the horrors of Stalin's regime was the Ukrainian famine. Please star the heck out of this. You'll have several documents on this in your document set, which means they've used this a lot on the regents. The Ukrainians call this the Holodomor, which means hunger extermination. So the Ukrainians were a group of people who were forced through invasion to be part of the USSR. They speak a Slavic-based language, though it's not exactly Russian. And as Stalin tries to roll out these collectives and force the Ukrainians to give their land, to turn their land over to the Russian state, to the government, it's abusing its power, you saw the Ukrainians resist, sometimes violently and sometimes by hoarding food or refusing to give over food. And so Stalin basically hatches a plan. The problem with the Ukraine is it's full of Ukrainians. So he orders the military, orders the army and secret police to go in there and seize all of the food and ship it out or store it in very well-policed government warehouses. And then he basically closed the borders of the Ukraine and just let them all starve. All right, they seized all the food surpluses and then just let the Ukrainians starve in their own country. And, accounts differ how many people died. Russia gives the lowball estimate of 2.5 million. The Ukrainians say closer almost to 8 million people died of starvation and malnutrition during this. And certainly this is a forced famine. I would like to be clear. The land, the soil of the Ukraine is actually very fertile. It is called, in fact, or was called, the breadbasket of Russia. They're taking the food from them, like they did in Ireland, like they did in India. This is a man-made or forced famine, purposely to kill the Ukrainians off, to crush their nationalistic movement, wishing to run themselves and not be a part of the Soviet Union. And then after this famine and millions of Ukrainians die, Stalin basically starts shipping in Russians who were, quote unquote, loyal to Stalin. He starts shipping in friendly Russian families, especially to the eastern Ukraine, to set up shop. Because there's villages that are literally empty of people because everyone died of starvation. And Stalin reasons that these Russians will be loyal to the state and he won't have to worry about them. So this is a genocide. He is targeting ethnic Ukrainians. It is a violation of human rights. He is starving them, withholding food, and not allowing them to flee. Like normally, if there's a famine, you can leave the area where there's no food and try to find an area with food. He says, no, you're dying. So that will basically finish up our examination of Stalinist Russia. We will be talking about Stalin during World War II and a little bit after, and a little bit during the early Cold War as well. But I want you to keep in mind the sheer violence and repressive nature of Stalin's regime. And this is just a little fun with Photoshop. Part of this whole propaganda thing was, Stalin exiled and had exiled and purged all these former members of the Communist Party, but he still wanted like pictures and paintings and stuff like that. So there was this constant work to like make history reflect Stalin's vision of history. So this guy got purged, but Stalin still wanted a picture of this canal that the Soviets built. So you just kind of Photoshop him out. That is our lecture on Stalin. We will continue with the rise of totalitarianism and fascism in Europe in the part 2 of these video notes. Thank you for joining. Have a great day.